The Vanished Vintner, 1996 harvest, Napa Valley, empty barrel. The vineyards of Napa Valley have long been synonymous with America's finest wines. A landscape of rolling hills and meticulous rows, where some of the world's most celebrated vintages are born. But in the autumn of 1996, in a small family winery tucked against the eastern foothills, the harvest that year would yield something far more troubling than wine. It would yield a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. Welcome to a story of the Vanished Vintner. It was the third week of October, 1996. The grape harvest in Napa Valley was drawing to a close, and the air hung thick with the sweet, fermented smell of crushed fruit and the earthy scent of turned soil. For the better part of a decade, the name Alessandro Marchetti had become quietly familiar to a small circle of wine enthusiasts who appreciated his small-batch Cabernet Sauvignon, produced from a modest 12-acre vineyard along the Silverado Trail in Calistoga. Marchetti was not a wealthy man, nor was he interested in becoming one. At 53 years old, he had emigrated from Tuscany in 1979, bringing with him 3 generations of winemaking knowledge and an unwavering belief that great wine required patience, precision, and an almost spiritual connection to the land. Those who knew him described a man of few words but deep presence, with silver-streaked dark hair, weathered hands that bore the permanent stains of grape juice, and eyes that seemed perpetually focused on some middle distance, as though constantly evaluating the quality of a vintage not yet produced. His wife, Elena, had returned to Italy in 1991 following the death of her mother, and while the marriage technically continued, she remained in Florence while Alessandro remained devoted to his vines. Their only son, Marco, had shown little interest in winemaking and had moved to San Francisco to work in technology, leaving Alessandro to manage the vineyard with a small crew of 4 permanent employees. On the morning of October 17, 1996, a day that dawned gray and unusually cold for the region, Alessandro Marchetti arrived at the winery at approximately 6:30 in the morning, as was his custom. His white Ford pickup was seen in the parking area adjacent to the fermentation barn. A worker named Miguel Ortiz, who arrived at 7, reported seeing the lights on in the small office where Marchetti kept his blending notes and winemaking journals. Miguel would be the last person to see Alessandro Marchetti alive. By noon, when the crew gathered for lunch beneath the pergola behind the main building, no one had seen the winemaker since morning. His pickup remained in the same spot. His leather satchel, which he carried everywhere and which contained his personal effects, including his wallet, his reading glasses, and a small leather-bound notebook where he recorded daily observations, still hung on the hook behind the office door. His dinner jacket, the one he wore on the rare occasions he entertained guests, still hung on the coat rack in the tasting room. Everything was in its place, except Alessandro Marchetti himself. The investigation began that evening when Marco, concerned by his father's failure to return his telephone call, drove up from the city. What he found was not a crime scene in any recognizable sense. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no forced entry. The winery stood as it always had, neat and orderly, the copper vats gleaming in the fading autumn light. The only indication that something was amiss was a single door left ajar in the fermentation barn, a door that Alessandro Marchetti was meticulous about keeping locked, as it led to the cave he had excavated beneath the hillside where he aged his finest barrels. Detectives from the Napa County Sheriff's Department arrived the following morning and immediately noted the peculiar circumstances. There was no ransom demand, no suicide note, no indication of financial trouble. The winery's books were in order. Marchetti had no known enemies, no history of violence, no involvement with criminal organizations. He was, by every account, a man who lived quietly and devoted himself entirely to his craft. Yet he had vanished completely, as though the earth itself had opened up and swallowed him whole. The search expanded quickly. Dogs were brought in to track a scent from the winery, but they led investigators only as far as the edge of the vineyard before turning back, confused or perhaps simply unwilling to follow a trail that led nowhere in particular. A helicopter circled the surrounding hills. Volunteers fanned out through the brush and drainage ditches along the Silverado Trail. But Alessandro Marchetti was not found that week, nor the next, nor in the months that followed. As the investigation deepened, details emerged that only deepened the mystery. Detectives learned that October 17th had been, by all accounts, an ordinary day. There had been no phone calls of unusual length, no visitors expected, no appointments on Marchetti's calendar. The weather that morning had been overcast, with fog rolling in from the bay and temperatures in the low 50s. By early afternoon, light rain had begun to fall, a typical autumn pattern that would continue on and off for several days. It was weather that, in the experience of local investigators, often complicated the search for missing persons, washing away scent trails and making the ground difficult to traverse. The cave beneath the fermentation barn became the focal point of early speculation. Alessandro had spent 2 years excavating it himself, working evenings and weekends with a pickaxe and a wheelbarrow, determined to create the perfect environment for aging his Cabernet. The space was modest, perhaps 40 feet deep, carved into the volcanic soil of the hillside and reinforced with timber supports. Inside, at the time of his disappearance, there were approximately 30 barrels of wine in various stages of aging, each marked with a designation and the year of the vintage. Detectives noted that one barrel, located in the far corner of the cave near the back wall, had been moved recently. The dust on the floor around it had been disturbed, and the barrel itself, a French oak cask that Marchetti had specifically marked for his 1994 reserve, was now sitting at a slight angle, as though it had been rolled aside and not quite returned to its original position. It was a small detail, perhaps insignificant, but it nagged at investigators. Alessandro Marchetti was a man who kept meticulous records, who arranged his barrels with the precision of a librarian organizing books. The misplaced barrel was out of character. Yet when detectives rolled it aside to examine the space behind it, they found nothing unusual. The back wall of the cave was solid earth, undisturbed. There were no hidden passages, no secret compartments, no indication of where the winemaker might have gone. Witness accounts from the surrounding area proved inconclusive. A woman who lived approximately a quarter mile south along the Silverado Trail reported hearing a vehicle pass her house sometime around 8 or 9 in the morning, but she could not identify the make or model. A delivery driver who passed through Calistoga that afternoon remembered nothing unusual. The 4 employees who worked at the winery were each interviewed at length, and while none could provide an explanation for Marchetti's disappearance, their accounts collectively painted a portrait of a man who had become increasingly preoccupied in the weeks before his vanishing. According to Miguel Ortiz, Marchetti had been receiving telephone calls that he did not discuss with the crew, calls that seemed to agitate him in ways they had not previously seen. He had also begun spending more time alone in the cave, sometimes for hours at a time, examining barrels and muttering to himself. On one occasion, approximately a week before his disappearance, Marchetti had canceled a scheduled tasting with a wine critic from San Francisco, citing illness, though Miguel observed that he did not appear unwell. Whether these details were significant or simply the ordinary eccentricities of a complex man, investigators could not determine. The financial records of the winery revealed nothing extraordinary. Marchetti had recently invested heavily in new equipment, a sign that he was planning for the future, not preparing to disappear. His accounts showed modest but consistent income from wine sales, enough to sustain the operation, but not enough to suggest wealth that might attract predators. There were no outstanding debts, no loans in default, no signs of financial distress. In the months that followed, the investigation drifted into the slow, grinding work of a cold case. Detectives followed leads that went nowhere, interviewed acquaintances who knew nothing, requested assistance from federal agencies that had little to offer. Alessandro Marchetti's name was entered into national missing persons databases, His fingerprints were submitted to the FBI, and his photograph was distributed to law enforcement agencies across the country. Nothing came of it. Marco Marchetti assumed control of the winery and attempted to continue his father's legacy, but the magic seemed to have departed with Alessandro. The 1996 harvest was completed under difficult conditions, and the wine that resulted was considered unremarkable, a far cry from the vintages his father had produced. Within 3 years, the winery was sold to a larger operation, and the Marchetti name faded from the wine lists of Napa Valley. Today, more than a quarter of a century later, the disappearance of Alessandro Marchetti remains officially unsolved. The case was never closed, but it was relegated to the inactive files, a cold mystery that no one had the resources or the leads to pursue. The vineyard along the Silverado Trail is now planted with different grapes, tended by different hands, and the cave beneath the fermentation barn has been sealed. But there are those who remember, and there are questions that remain unanswered. Where did Alessandro Marchetti go on that gray October morning? What, if anything, did he discover in his cave that caused him to neglect the ordinary precautions of a man who valued routine above all? And what became of the barrel that was moved, the 1994 reserve that was meant to be his finest vintage, the wine he had spent years nurturing and had planned to release to critical acclaim? In the file, there is a final note from the lead detective, written in 1998 and left unsigned. It reads simply, "Some men vanish into their work. Some vanish into their obsessions. Marchetti may have vanished into something else entirely, something we were never able to name." The cave remains sealed. The barrel was never found. And somewhere in the hills of Napa Valley, beneath the vines that continue to grow year after year, the answer to what happened to Alessandro Marchetti sleeps in the dark, undisturbed, waiting perhaps for the day when someone will finally roll back the stone and look behind it. Perhaps that day will come. Perhaps it will not. But the question remains, as it has remained for nearly 3 decades. What does a man leave behind when he leaves everything behind, and what, in the end, does he take with him?